This is the Eagle's Nest sinkhole in Florida. From the surface, it's just an unremarkable, uninviting, and algae-filled little pond. But this view of it is deceptive. At the bottom of this little pond is a 6-foot wide vertical tube leading to a massive, pitch-black cave room the size of an airplane hangar. And that is just the beginning. These are the Eagle's Nest cave dive disasters and why it's one of the most dangerous dive sites on Earth. As always, viewer discretion is advised. If you drive just an hour north of Tampa, Florida, you'll find the Chassahowitzka Wildlife Management Area, which covers about 24,000 acres of forested wetland and sandhills. The area is home to some unique wildlife, like the Florida black bear and several species of endangered snakes, but that's not all. Nestled right in the middle of this massive reserve is a small body of water that looks like a near-perfect circle from the sky. Standing at sea level, though, it's about as nondescript and uninviting as you can imagine. If you didn't know any better, you might swear the algae-infested pool was a haven for alligators, and taking just a few steps onto the boardwalk that leads to the water is usually enough to drive people off, thanks to mosquitoes and ticks. This pool is known as Eagle's Nest and is one of Florida's many sinkholes, which have developed over millions of years of erosion. And while it may seem like an unremarkable pond while standing on its banks, those who know what they're looking at see nothing but beauty and adventure. It's for this reason that untold numbers of people flock to it every year from all over the world. That's because what lies below the surface makes Eagle's Nest special. It's a bit cliche at this point, and you've probably heard several caves referred to this way, but according to the cave diving community, Eagle's Nest is another of the Mount Everest of their sport. And much like the actual Mount Everest, it's earned this reputation. The pool itself is not unlike any other pond as you descend the first 20 feet or 6 meters. At around the 20-foot mark though, the pool's bottom forms a basin with what looks like a large drain at the center. In actuality, it's a 6-foot or 2-meter wide vertical tunnel that almost transports divers into another world entirely. At the end of the short tunnel is nothing but expansive pitch-black darkness, and that's because the tunnel ends in a place called the ballroom. This room is so big that it's been compared to the size of an airplane hangar, and cave divers who've experienced the ballroom say that being inside it is like being on a different planet or even floating through outer space. If that already wasn't incredible enough, at the very bottom of this massive chamber is a sloped debris pile where divers can choose one of several tunnels to explore. There are 2 downstream tunnels and 1 upstream tunnel. Before they make that choice, however, they're faced with a serious reality check. It can be easy for divers to get caught up in all there is to see inside the Eagle's Nest, but a sign was installed to shock visitors to the cave back to Earth. This sign is the infamous sign featuring a drawing of a Grim Reaper standing over several fallen divers, and the sign reads, quote, "Stop, prevent your own death, go no further," end quote. Below this impossible to miss warning are several facts about just how dangerous Eagle's Nest can be, and that goes for even the most experienced and certified cave divers. At the very minimum, divers who enter Eagle's Nest are advised to be fully certified in cave diving, hold a certification in Trimix, which is a gas mixture for deep dives, and have a wealth of experience inside deep caves. And even divers who meet all those specifications are recommended to dive Eagle's Nest for the first time with someone extremely familiar with the cave. And finally, the very bottom of the sign reads, quote, "There's nothing in this cave worth dying for," end quote. So what is it about Eagle's Nest that makes it such a dangerous dive, yet simultaneously incredible enough for people to keep entering? With a map depth of 310 feet or 95 meters, it's not the deepest cave ever covered on the channel, but it's definitely at or near the top of the list in terms of the most challenging. To date, at least 13 people have lost their lives inside since 1981, and while that might seem like an unimpressive number, consider that a study that looked at cave diving between 1985 and 2015, which is a 30-year period, determined that there were 161 American cave diving fatalities. The 2 time periods we're talking about don't line up perfectly, but Eagle's Nest would still account for 8% of those deaths. Or put another way, for every 11 cave deaths that occurred in the US, 1 of them occurred in the Eagle's Nest system, despite there being hundreds of caves to dive in across the US. Like for example, on Christmas Day in 2013, Darren and his son Dylan entered Eagle's Nest for a dive together. The father and son had just received new air tanks as Christmas gifts, and they were eager to try them out. Unfortunately, as far as fitting the requirements, while Darren was fully certified and experienced, Dylan, who was only 15 years old, was not. It's unknown what their dive plan was, but according to the dive computers on their wrists, they went as deep as 233 feet or 71 meters. This is a depth where most divers would switch to a different gas part of the way down to avoid nitrogen narcosis. However, it seems that the father and son didn't, and it's thought that as they descended, they became more and more intoxicated by the regular air under the immense pressure. This then led them to losing track of time and eventually becoming so low in air that they didn't have enough to make it back to the surface. And when they realized they didn't have enough air to make it back, the father and son likely panicked, causing Dylan to rapidly use up what was available in his tanks. When those were depleted, Dylan then switched to a second regulator connected to a long hose on his father's tanks, but with both of them by then breathing from the same supply, this only exacerbated the situation. It's believed that Darren then lost consciousness when the air ran out, and upon noticing that the tanks were empty, Dylan spit the regulator out of his mouth and frantically tried to make it to the surface on a breath hold. Tragically, however, neither of them survived the incident. Darren's body was later found on the debris pile at the bottom of the ballroom, and Dylan was found floating not far from a spare set of tanks they'd stashed on the way down. And this isn't the only time something like this has happened here. A similar incident was actually the first recorded tragedy at Eagle's Nest. In December of 1981, 29-year-old Terry and her husband Larry came to the Sinkhole and were all inside one of the tunnels with 3 other divers. The dive they performed that day was one the couple had performed without an incident several times before, but as Terry held onto Larry's leg while they were heading through a tunnel, she suddenly let go. A split second later, when Larry turned to look, Terry was motionless in the water with her regulator floating outside of her mouth right beside her. He then desperately tried to get the regulator back into her mouth, but he was unsuccessful, and eventually he lost his grip on her. With not much other choice, he then left his wife and shot back to the surface, where he found a man named Jim Bentz taking photos of the surface pool. Luckily, it just so happened that Jim was a certified diving instructor and rescue diver, so when he learned from Larry what was going on, he quickly suited up, grabbed a single tank of air, and descended into Eagle's Nest. Jim, however, never resurfaced either. When a rescue team later found him, he was floating lifelessly around 250 feet or 76 meters. In a further tragic twist of fate, Jim's friends told the media that he was considering giving up cave diving over concerns about the sport's safety. Reports also say that Terry, just like Darren and Dylan, was breathing regular air despite being well below 200 feet or 61 meters. It's believed Terry and Jim both suffered debilitating bouts of nitrogen narcosis that led to their deaths. These incidents bring up yet another issue that can occur inside Eagle's Nest, and any cave for that matter, and that's when divers push themselves beyond their limits. The sign at the top of the debris pile provides a clear and sobering warning about this particular danger, but for one reason or another, many divers either ignore it or overestimate their abilities and experience. In another incident, on the evening of July 18, 2018, 20-year-old Sed arrived in the parking lot outside Eagle's Nest with a handful of other divers. This group of divers, however, was a bit different and were known as free divers. Just like cave and scuba divers, free divers wear wetsuits, masks, and fins, but they dive without air tanks of any kind. In other words, each dive is performed on a breath hold only. In any case, for hours after their arrival, members of the group would linger at the surface as each of them performed their free dives, which usually consisted of getting to a specific depth as quickly as possible with the help of some kind of weight or ballast. Then, once at depth, this group did some brief exploring before kicking their way back up to the surface. It was getting late when Sed was going to perform his last dive, and for this one, he wanted to break his own personal record by reaching the 80-foot or 24-meter mark. The rest of the group then watched as he and another diver disappeared under the water and dropped like stones, disappearing into the darkness of the ballroom. It's unclear just how long Sed could hold his breath for, but amateur freedivers can usually last a few minutes underwater, so their dives take a fraction of the time cave divers spend underwater with tanks. Either way, very quickly it became clear that something had gone terribly wrong when Sed didn't return to the surface. Several members of the group then raced into Eagle's Nest to try to locate and help him, but he was nowhere to be found. And because of the immense depth of the ballroom, they couldn't swim any deeper on just a breath hold. As this was happening at the same time, others were calling for emergency help. However, after rescue divers arrived at the scene, it didn't take too long to find Sed. His lifeless body was discovered on the debris pile about 150 feet or 46 meters below the surface. And unfortunately, based on the available information, it's not entirely clear what went wrong in his dive. And in fact, beyond that, even when almost everything goes right, Eagle's Nest has a way of claiming lives. At 55 years old, Charles was one of 4 divers who arrived at Eagle's Nest on the morning of January 8, 2017 to do some exploring. One of the divers in the group experienced some sort of equipment malfunction before they descended and pulled himself from the dive as a result. The other 3, including Charles, who had only been diving for 2 years and had no cave experience, went ahead with their plan. All three then descended through the vertical tunnel into the ballroom without incident when suddenly, at around 100 feet or 33 meters, Charles went limp. The other two then rushed to him to see if he was okay, but he had somehow lost consciousness. They immediately initiated their ascent, but they also had to be careful not to go too fast to avoid decompression sickness. On the surface, as the diver who had to remain behind was loading his gear into his car, he heard the other surface and rushed to the pool to see why they were so early. He then managed to pull Charles from the water, but whatever happened to him, it was already too late. When medical services arrived, he was pronounced dead at the scene, and an autopsy showed he had suffered a heart attack during the dive. In a separate incident, Davin, a 53-year-old pilot and spearfisherman, came to Eagle's Nest with his good friend Greg on January 20th, 2018. The two divers only planned to go to around the top of the ballroom, which is around 70 feet or 21 meters down, as that's all their experience would allow for. As they entered the seemingly endless blackness of the ballroom, David also suddenly went limp. Davin was dead before emergency medical help could arrive, and authorities speculated that he also suffered a heart attack during his dive. Many years before Charles and Davin passed away at Eagle's Nest, 29-year-old Brent had his first experience there in August 1990. He was a certified dive instructor who had just wrapped up an introductory course in cave diving when he entered Eagle's Nest. His dive partners that day knew he was inexperienced in caves, particularly deep caves, but what they didn't know was that Brent had been suffering blackouts underwater for about a year leading up to that dive. There are a number of reasons why someone might black out during a dive, from holding your breath unnecessarily to nitrogen narcosis or oxygen toxicity, but it's unclear what exactly was the cause of Brent's trend of losing consciousness. However, either way, at some point during his Eagle's Nest dive, he lost consciousness and then sank to the bottom of the ballroom. His body was eventually found at the 190-foot or 60-meter mark. Now, unlike many of the nearby springs in the area, another thing that makes Eagle's Nest dangerous is that it's not exactly known for always offering crystal clear conditions. Everything depends on how the weather has been and how the current is running on any given day. Most often, the water in Eagle's Nest is somewhere around slightly cloudy, but it can also become dark and muddy due to organic coloring in the water called tannins. And this is all on top of the ever-present threat of accidentally reducing the visibility to zero by disturbing the silt along the cave's walls. To avoid this, cave divers will do their best to keep their profile as trim as possible and use techniques like a frog kick to move around, but it can still happen anyway. As cave diving became more popular and due to the handful of deaths that occurred in Eagle's Nest before the turn of the century, the Wildlife Refuge actually banned diving there in 1999. The cave diving community was upset about this and immediately began lobbying for Eagle's Nest to be reopened to them. And it took quite a bit of convincing, but in 2003 their efforts were successful and diving was once again allowed at the Sinkhole. As you might have expected though, not even a year later, tragedy struck again on June 12, 2004 when 36-year-old John and 44-year-old Craig showed up, eager for the opportunity to dive Eagle's Nest. Up to that point, John had been certified for 10 years and Craig earned his cave diving certification just 2 years earlier. Around 1 p.m., they got their diving underway with John using an underwater scooter. This made moving around inside quite a bit faster. Unfortunately, if the scooter isn't handled carefully, the water disturbed by the propeller can cause a silt out. Sometime later, the two divers were expected to be back around 2:30, but when they still hadn't arrived at 3:30, their support team called 911. Around 3 p.m. the following day, John's body was found 1,000 feet or 305 meters inside one of the system's tunnels, still wearing all of his equipment but lacking any gas in his main and secondary tanks. It would take another 2 days for Craig to be found about 290 feet or 88 meters further inside the cave and completely tangled up in a rope. It's believed that at some point in the dive, the two found themselves in a silt out, and in a moment of panic, John dropped his scooter and grabbed the guideline. Horrifyingly though, it's thought that either due to panic or the lack of a directional marker, John then followed the line in the opposite direction of the exit. This mistake, while disoriented, caused him to eventually run out of air entirely. Craig likely made a similar error, but then as he followed the rope, he came to an area where there was a jump in the line. It seems that as he was attaching his own line to make the jump, he got wrapped up in it, and then around then he ran out of gas completely and died where he was found. In another incident involving highly experienced and properly certified divers, Patrick, Chris, and Justin planned an extensive dive at Eagle's Nest for October 16, 2016. Patrick and Chris were the most experienced of the three, and Justin was going along to explore some of the shallower sections while the other two performed a much more advanced dive. The day before their dive, the three stashed trimix, decompression, and bailout tanks along the guidelines so that when they arrived on the 16th, they could just get right to diving. Justin's main role that day was to dive to a particular depth at 3 p.m. and ensure that Patrick and Chris were in the decompression stage of their dive. The decompression stage, as many of you are probably familiar with, is another critical element of cave diving, particularly for those reaching extreme depths like you'll find in Eagle's Nest. As a diver descends, nitrogen gas is absorbed by the soft tissues, but on ascent, that nitrogen comes back into the bloodstream, which carries it to the lungs so it can be expelled while exhaling. But crucially, this is a process that occurs slowly and is related to the time and depth spent underwater. And this is such an important process because if the ascent is too quick, the nitrogen will form bubbles in the blood, which can cause a variety of issues. In mild cases, it can cause joint and muscle pain, headache, and weakness, but in more serious cases, it can lead to paralysis or even death. Sometime in the afternoon that day, Patrick, Chris, and Justin descended together, and when they reached Justin's max depth, they stopped for a moment and flashed each other the OK hand signal before Patrick and Chris continued on. Just like they planned, Justin came back to his max depth at 3 o'clock after exploring for a while, but when he looked below him, there was no sign of his dive partners. Every half hour, Justin returned to depth to check on Patrick and Chris, but when neither of them was seen by 6 o'clock, Justin then called the Cave Country Dive Shop and spoke with a rescue diver. A rescue diver then rushed to Eagle's Nest with a team of support divers on the way, but things weren't in place to safely conduct a search and rescue dive until around 11 o'clock that night. 2 rescue divers then entered Eagle's Nest and took turns searching the upstream tunnels once they were inside the ballroom. After an extensive look around the upstream corridors with finding nothing, they turned and made their way through the downstream tunnel. However, when they surfaced around 3:30 in the morning, they did so empty-handed without finding Patrick or Chris. Another pair of divers then took over from there, entering one of the other downstream tunnels toward an area known as the pit. Almost immediately on the exit side of the pit, they found the lifeless bodies of Patrick and Chris. Based on what was observed when the bodies were found, including data from their respective dive computers, here is what is believed to have happened. Around 43 minutes into their dive, the pair arrived at the pit and spent a few moments outside it before entering, likely to determine a plan to navigate the tight restrictions there. At around the 49-minute mark, they entered the restriction but then backed out several minutes later. They then waited again before a second attempt was made at around 58 minutes, but 3 minutes later, something strange occurred. One of them then abandoned the rebreather apparatus they were wearing. A rebreather recycles exhaled gas, turning it into breathable gas, which can extend dive time and limit the bubbles a diver produces. At some point as well, the secondary long hose on one of their air tanks was deployed, and the pair began breathing from the same tank. It's unclear if one of them suffered some kind of mechanical issue, but it was apparent at the scene that one of them got stuck in the restriction and the other was attempting to free him. Unfortunately, at around 85 minutes into the dive, the 2 men ran out of gas despite being in the vicinity of a bail-up bottle of gas they'd stashed the day before. And unfortunately, they never even made it to their planned decompression stops. So in the end, what is known is that it seems that there were 2 experienced divers who were at a restriction when something occurred that required one of the divers to remove his rebreather despite it functioning correctly. They then began buddy breathing while trying to navigate the restriction, but between whatever they were dealing with and the tight cave passages, they ran out of gas before making it to safety. It's been suggested that one man may have gotten stuck and the other man died trying to get him out. As you may have noticed, many of the incidents that occurred at Eagle's Nest didn't occur during some crazy deep technical dive. There were a couple, and probably some more that aren't widely publicized, but by and large, the incidents occurred due to a variety of factors that aren't entirely related to the cave itself. In fact, in some cases, they were simply freak accidents. So, much like the infamous Blue Hole of Dahab, due to a lack of records, it's not entirely clear if Eagle's Nest is uniquely dangerous or if there are simply more dives that occur there, resulting in a higher raw number of deaths. Either way, Eagle's Nest Sinkhole remains open to this day to the cave diving community. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching.